This presentation explores 7 influences on fashion in the 1920s, the Jazz Age. The 1920s experienced an economic boom of prosperity that fueled a consumer culture on a scale never achieved before. Huge factories that sprang up to support the war now turned to consumer goods of every type, and wartime technology was applied to civilian life. This was an optimistic time, funded by new millionaires and a large population of young people with money to spend. Many Americans moved to cities and suburbs, creating a lively scene by and for young people. They developed an independent lifestyle that shocked their parents, including slang words their parents didn't know. There are several videos on YouTube featuring this slang if you'd like to hear it. Young people readily adopted all the technological changes, and the press followed socially prominent pace setters who took up driving, flying airplanes, boating, and other activities. Today, we would call them influencers. In the 1920s, they were called flappers in America and bright young things in Britain. The term flapper referred to a fad of wearing rain galoshes unclipped, just as young people stopped tying their sneaker shoelaces not too long ago. The rubber galoshes made a flapping sound when they walked, and a name was born. Young women broke many traditional rules, creating the first generation to openly rebel against their community's standards. The soldiers and nurses in World War I were the first to receive basic sex education. Women started smoking, drinking, flirting, dating, wearing heavy makeup, and even kissing, things that 10 years ago only prostitutes did. The fashion press started to feature younger fashions, not just fashions for mature, established society women. There's a large increase in the number of fashion magazines sold in the 1920s. Even though Vogue was first published in 1892, it did not begin to influence the major consumer market until the 1920s. It adopted fresh new graphics influenced by Art Deco and youthful styles to appeal to a newly modern clientele. During the Victorian age, few families outside the wealthiest attended college, and even then it was primarily men. Men and women began attending classes in record numbers, and college applications soared. By the end of the decade, 20% of college-age Americans were enrolled in a college. This change altered not only the makeup of U.S. college campuses, but marked a turning point in the lives of young people. For now on, they would throw off their elders' shackles and make an impression on the face of their country. Young people, for once, were making headlines instead of their parents. This included students enrolling in what we now term historically black colleges. A large number of colleges were formed in the last half of the 19th century, so by the 1920s they were established institutions. College students developed their own fads, such as Oxford bags, a style of trouser developed at Oxford University in England, where there was a strict dress code, including not allowing knickerbockers in class. Students who wanted to play sports after their classes hid their knickers under huge trousers that became known as their bags. The popularity of jazz music, and especially young people enjoying music, was unprecedented. The bouncy jazz tunes encouraged new dance trends. The Charleston quickly became the most popular dance in the United States. The new, looser dress styles with no waistline allowed freedom of movement and were favored for dancing in clubs. The dresses were sleeveless and skirts approached knee length. The black bottom dance, as seen on the right, originated among African Americans in the rural South. It was eventually adopted by mainstream American culture and became a national craze in the 1920s. Both the Charleston and the Black Bottom were performed in clubs, on Broadway, and in films, creating a wide audience. The second important influence was Prohibition, the best thing that could have happened to jazz music. Practically overnight, New York sprouted 5,000 speakeasies. While some were quiet and hidden away, many were raucous nightclubs operating openly and legally. The club would sell its patrons soft drinks or other beverages, and if you wanted to add alcohol, you visited the gangster selling it at a back table to complete your cocktail. Clubs developed elaborate dance shows and also offered dancing for their patrons on a dance floor. These nightclubs will contribute to making it possible for respectable women to go out in the evening and even drink in public. Disguising the alcohol in drinks created two new necessities. The first was the cocktail. The second was the cocktail dress, the need for a new style of semi-formal dress to be worn earlier in the evening than the theater or for formal dinner. The dress was hemmed short, not formal to the floor, and it was alluring, perfect for dancing with a partner. The nightclub atmosphere was perfect for glittering decor such as beads and sequins, and items were added that worked well with frantic dance movement, such as fringe and scarves. The third influence is the new importance of sub-Saharan African culture. The interest in African art started in Paris. A museum of ethnography opened in 1882, dedicated to preserving items from around the world that were in danger of vanishing due to colonialism and modernism. Some art historians say that modern painting began the day in 1907 that Picasso visited that museum and saw African objects for the first time. It was one of the inspirations for the development of Cubism, to see the face and body as a series of shapes and planes instead of realistic light and shadow. By the 1920s, an awareness of African art was all through the zeitgeist and entered the American consciousness. In 1935, the Museum of Modern Art in New York created an exhibition of African objects as art instead of ethnographic artifacts. African American culture will begin to flower with a new interest in African art. Black music, art, dance, literature, and performance will for the first time influence the dominant American culture that had been so Eurocentric. White audiences were exposed to black creativity through club culture, and no place was more influential than Harlem, New York. This astonishing flower of arts is now called the Harlem Renaissance. Record companies and films will descend on Harlem to feature the performers, and they took these artists worldwide. One important style maker was Josephine Baker, born in St. Louis, Missouri. She emigrated to Paris, noting that she could not be in America anymore. She quickly grew famous as a cabaret performer. A specialty was creating dances with African themes that included drums, rhythm, and African movement. Her fame coincided with the 1925 Paris exhibition that featured Art Deco to the world and a new interest in France in African art. She quickly became part of the Paris art world, mixing with Picasso, Jean Cocteau, and Ernest Hemingway. Her glamorous wardrobe and exploits were frequently covered in the press, and she became a style icon. A fourth important influence was androgyny for young women. It begins with artists, intellectuals, and writers, and it will spread to manifest in various degrees through society. Some young women adopted a style called la garçon, which we can see on the left. Garments that have traditional feminine attributes mixed with some traditional masculine attributes, such as short hair and trousers. A more extreme version was dressing completely as a young man, visible in the photo on the right. This is a family photo with Frida Kahlo at age 16 in 1924, dressed as a young gentleman. This aspect of the garçon style was more common, repressing the bodily curves of a mature female form to create a more youthful, adolescent, or androgynous figure. Young women began to assert their independence, and la garçon is a landmark style solution. It will be the first of several times in the 20th century that progressive women reject the trappings of what is expected of adult women in society. Those who have not developed a traditional sexuality may perhaps escape the normal social ideas constructed for that sexual identity. We will see this again in the 1960s and 1970s, and some might argue right now in the second decade of the new millennium. The garçon style was most commonly seen when practicing sports or other vigorous activities. It helped to be wealthy and therefore above the rules, to be a pace setter. France appeared to be more tolerant than some other places. However, this style was not without controversy, and every community set its own standards. The designer most associated with the mainstream version of La Garçon is Coco Chanel, a Parisian couture who introduced many aspects of men's wear to women's wardrobe. The item that brought her first to notice was using stretchy wool knit jersey in women's garments, a fabric first used for men's long underwear, sports shirts, and bathing suits. She began her career very poor, and she bought wool jersey because it was very cheap. An example of one of her earliest designs is on the left. Coco Chanel will go on to introduce the sweater, worn by everyday people as couture fashion. She would create a suit women could wear all day or for most kinds of events. She invented the little black dress that could be dressed up or down for different social events. She promoted the use of costume jewelry that could be worn as trendy fashion. And she will make respectable the version of La Garçon originated by progressive young women. Chanel's greatest contribution to women's fashion is the Chanel suit, which is still made today. Chanel adopted the idea of the cardigan sweater and crossed it with a tailored jacket worn by men, and she kept comfort and durability in mind, something that had never been considered for women's fashion before. I have listed the general hallmarks of a Chanel suit in the Vocabulary and Concepts handout. Following the history of the Chanel suit is to follow the history of 20th century fashion in one signature item. In 2020, Billie Eilish wore a Chanel suit for the Oscars red carpet. Chanel's designs influenced all levels of fashion. In the teens, we saw women dressing in sportswear, a top, a sweater, and a skirt. So now dresses themselves would break into two sportswear-like pieces, such as a sweater and a skirt. Note, these women still wear gloves outdoors, still considered a vital accessory to be fully dressed for social occasions. Sweaters and long knit shirts appear to drop the waistline to the hip, and this will indeed affect the overall fashion silhouette. It also erases the idea of a smaller waistline, contributing to the adolescent look. An important part of the garçon look was short hair. Young women began to cut their hair in a new style called a bob. This was one form of garçon dressing that even women who wore conventional clothing could partake in. The Catholic Church objected mightily to this hairstyle, as did many traditional members of society. The most daring women started bobbing their hair in the late teens, and by the 1920s it was more common. The bob could be worn cut very smoothly and geometrically, as befits an Art Deco hairstyle. We see an example of movie star Louise Brooks at top right wearing the Art Deco version. Or the bob could have waves set into it using special clips. These are called Marcel waves. To contemplate how radical this change is, let's take a moment to consider the changes we see in one 16-year period, the life of a teenager. The woman on the left would have dressed in a lingerie dress. If she had a teenage daughter who cut her hair and wore short skirts and knit fabrics, she would look like the teenager on the right. This posed a very large rift in society, and the generation gap was noticeable. Photos show us that many of the older generation did not adopt the new styles, continuing to wear modified styles from the 19-teens all the way through the 20s. 1922 marked one of the most momentous discoveries in archaeology, the tomb of King Tut. Tutankhamun was a relatively minor pharaoh, but his was the first untouched tomb found in the modern era by archaeologists who would study its significance. Immediately, a rage for ancient pyramid societies would begin: Egypt, the Mayans, and Aztecs. These motifs will be a heavy influence in Art Deco. Even cigarettes would follow this craze, with Camel cigarettes now available rolled and in packages. The original Camels were produced in 1913 with more of a Ballet Russe Scheherazade look. But by the 1920s, the camel graphic on the package had relocated to Egypt with an Art Deco style frame. Cigarettes were marketed directly to women for the first time. This brand, on the right, Egyptian Deities, wished to appeal to the exotic and sophisticated customer. We experience a Spanish-influenced fascination for both fashion and architecture, fueled by the Panama, California exhibition held in 1915 in San Diego. Both Florida and California were experiencing building booms as more people moved for the sunny climates. And so we see a large amount of both Art Deco architecture and Spanish Revival architecture in Florida and California. In 1923, movie star Paula Negri, seen here, starred in a film, The Spanish Dancers, and other films at the time, like Carmen, also fueled this fad. Spanish shawls, combs, and spit curls were everywhere. We can see flamenco ruffles on skirts influenced by this Spanish trend. Spanish shawls added glamour, and they fit the zeitgeist. Their geometric graphic embroidery styles looked Art Deco already. The long fringes appealed to the flapper desire for movement, and they lent undeniable exotic glamour to 1920s styling. Spanish combs took on Art Deco styling as well, with an emphasis on geometric shapes. Celebrity culture grows with the invention of radio and then film. Not only will everyone want to look like their favorite movie star, but also the movies themselves will incorporate fashion shows, creating marketing ties with manufacturers and sellers. The fashions will reach millions of people around the world, staggering numbers no one ever thought of before. Both radio and films create yet another version of Americana and Western wear. Cowboy singers and actors create a glamorous, larger-than-life version of the American West. As the real West gave way to towns and working ranches subject to economic busts and booms, some ranches took in paid guests to tide themselves through tough times. Tourists came from all over the world to experience a taste of the Wild West, which had passed into mythology just a few decades earlier. As the railroad expanded widely in the 1920s, guest ranches called dude ranches sprang up. Back then, the word dude meant a city dweller or city slicker. Guests paid to stay on a working ranch to learn skills like horseback riding and even roping. Some ranches incorporated guests into the working day, others staged special events like chuck wagon dinners to create life on a cattle drive. This form of tourism spreads the taste for American Western wear around the country. Cowboy movie star Buck Jones starred in over 50 films, and he actually was a cowboy in Oklahoma before he joined traveling Wild West shows. We can see here the size of the cowboy hat has grown in size for the movies. This is called a 10-gallon hat made by Stetson. To add the glamour, Western costumes will incorporate aspects of Mexican arts, metal conchos, elaborate silver studs on the edges of clothing, decorated belt buckles. The leather itself could now be shiny. It is no coincidence all this shine and metals appear at the same time as Art Deco. Several new Western wear features begin in the 1920s. One is a yoke cut into the top of the shirt, forming points on the upper chest. Another is contrast piping. The outlined edges you see in black on the white shirt and white on the black shirt. A third new element is pockets cut in semicircular shapes called smile pockets. And last, we see the addition of decorative, shiny snaps on cowboy shirts. Movie star Tom Mix was a rodeo performer before films, and he was known for his flamboyant style. The yoke will quickly become an area to decorate in flat, graphic style motifs, including flowers, borrowing from the Mexican traditions. Soon, stage and film cowboys will wear highly embroidered and decorated costumes. Under the influence of Mexican traditions and Art Deco, cowboy boots will also add fancy colors and decorations, including contrast color blocking. Cowboy boots are now owned by many men who live in the West or in the countryside or visited the West who have never even seen cattle. Western motifs are applied to American children's toys and all manner of products like pajamas, bed sheets, and curtains. And our dog for this unit is Pete the Pup, who you can see on right. So this is a dog in Hollywood history. He was a star in a series of films called Our Gang, featuring child actors called the Little Rascals. And of course, on the right, we can see a circle and an eyebrow drawn over Pete the Pup's eye as part of his character.